You're not broke because you're bad at money. Let me ask you something. Are you doing everything right? Working hard, avoiding big luxuries, maybe even picking up a side hustle, and still feeling like you're losing ground? Like no matter how fast you run, the finish line keeps moving? You're not imagining it. And you're not alone. In 2025, the minimum income needed to buy a median-priced starter home reached about $86,000. Let that sink in. You need to be earning close to 6 figures just to afford a starter home. A starting point. Not a dream home. Not a mansion in the suburbs. Just a place to call your own for the first time. And it gets worse. In just 6 years, the income required to afford a median-priced home in the United States jumped by 70%, from around $67,000 in 2019 to $114,000 in 2025. Your wages did not go up 70% in 6 years. Nobody did. And the damage isn't just financial. 84% of Gen Z aspiring homeowners say they're delaying major life decisions until they can afford a home. Marriage, kids, independence. All of it was pushed back because of a housing market that seems designed to keep you out. So what happened? Who broke this? And when? The answer takes us back to a Sunday night in August, 1971. And once you see what happened, you can't unsee it. Before 1971, the math was different. In 1965, the average American house cost about $20,000. The average salary was roughly $6,500. Do the math. A home cost about 3 times a worker's annual income. If you worked as a grocery store manager, 1 income, no side hustle, no investment portfolio, you could realistically pay off a mortgage in a decade, raise 2 kids, buy a car, and still retire with something in the bank. That was not the exception. That was the norm. Now look at where we are today. In 2022, the median house price was 5.81 times the median household income. That was up from 4.52 in 2010 and 3.57 in 1984. And it's gotten worse since then. In many major metro areas, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, Austin, the ratio is closer to 8, 9, even 10 times income. 2 incomes. No kids. Skipping every luxury the internet tells you to cut, and you're still locked out. Since the 1960s, home prices have risen 2.4 times faster than inflation. If home prices had simply kept pace with inflation, the median home would have cost only $177,500 in 2024. Instead, it cost $431,000. Read that twice. If home prices had just tracked inflation, if they had simply stayed proportionally the same, a median home would cost $177,500 today. Instead, it costs $431,000. That $253,500 gap isn't explained by supply chains, or interest rates, or avocado toast. It goes much deeper than that. Something broke the system, and it broke on a very specific night. To understand the trap, you need to understand what money was before it became what it is now. For most of recorded human history, money was a receipt, a placeholder for something real, something scarce, something that couldn't just be conjured into existence, usually gold. You couldn't print more gold. You couldn't pass a law and make gold appear. It had to be dug out of the earth at enormous cost and effort. That scarcity was the foundation of financial discipline. After World War II, the world was in ruins, except for the United States. America held roughly 2/3 of the world's gold supply. So in 1944, the world's major powers gathered at a resort in Bretton, New Hampshire, and made a deal. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency, but with one crucial anchor. Any country in the world could trade $35 for exactly 1 ounce of gold, guaranteed. No questions asked. This was the gold standard, and it imposed an iron discipline on the US government. If Washington wanted to spend money on wars, on social programs, on anything, it had to actually have gold to back it up. You couldn't just decide to print more dollars, because that would mean printing more receipts than there was gold in the vault. The fraud would be exposed instantly. The result was a period of historic economic stability and shared prosperity. The middle class grew dramatically. Savings actually meant something, because a dollar you put in the bank today would buy roughly the same amount 10 years from now. Wages rose alongside productivity. The deal between workers and the economy was simple and fair. Work harder. Produce more. Get paid more. That deal is what was broken in 1971. The 1960s were expensive, enormously expensive. On one side, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, federal education funding, the war on poverty, was a massive domestic spending program. On the other side, the Vietnam War was draining hundreds of billions of dollars and producing nothing but casualties and political chaos. To pay for both at the same time, the U.S. government started spending more than it had gold to back up. It was printing receipts for gold that didn't exist, and foreign governments started noticing. France was the first to call America's bluff. President Charles de Gaulle became convinced that the U.S. was cheating the system, printing dollars and exporting inflation to the rest of the world. So he did something extraordinary. He sent a literal warship to New York Harbor loaded with U.S. dollars, demanding gold in return. Other nations lined up behind France. It was a bank run, not on a single bank, but on the United States of America itself. The math was brutal. America owed far more gold than it actually held. There was only one way out. On the evening of August 15th, 1971, a Sunday when financial markets were closed, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced what he called his new economic policy. He was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. That was more than 50 years ago. The temporary suspension never ended. This was the birth of fiat money. Fiat comes from Latin. It means, let it be done. The dollar was no longer backed by anything you could hold in your hand. It was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. In other words, trust us. We said so. And with that, the golden handcuffs came off. If you've spent any time in online financial or economic circles, you've probably come across a website called WTF-happened-in-1971.com. It is one of the most quietly devastating collections of economic data ever assembled in one place. The idea behind it is simple. Take almost any major economic or social metric, wages, productivity, inequality, healthcare costs, housing costs, CEO pay, college tuition, or the money supply, and chart it over time. What you see, again and again, is something almost eerie. Before 1971, the lines tend to move together in healthy, proportional ways. After 1971, they begin to break apart, and then they explode away from each other. The most important chart may be the one comparing productivity to wages. Before 1971, those two lines track each other almost perfectly. As American workers became more productive, as technology, education, and infrastructure made each hour of labor more valuable, they got paid more. That is how a fair economy is supposed to work. More output should mean more income. But after 1971, the lines decouple. Productivity keeps climbing, steeply, dramatically, accelerating through the computer revolution and the internet age. But real wages for the average American worker flatten out. They stagnate. Adjusted for inflation, they are not dramatically different from where they were decades ago. So workers kept producing more. The economy kept generating more wealth. But the average worker stopped receiving a proportional share of it. So where did all that wealth go? Here is something most schools never taught: the Cantillon Effect. Named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, it describes a simple truth about newly created money. A truth so obvious, it is almost embarrassing. And yet, one the financial system works very hard to keep invisible. When the Federal Reserve creates new money, whether physically, digitally, or through the expansion of credit, that money does not appear in everyone's pocket at the same time. It enters the economy at specific points. It goes first to big banks, which can use it to buy assets. It goes to the federal government, which spends it through contracts and programs. It goes to large corporations, which can borrow at lower rates and gain access to capital before everyone else. By the time that newly created money reaches ordinary workers, through wages, salaries, or small business income, prices have often already moved higher. Groceries are already more expensive. Rent is already higher. Cars cost more. Housing costs more. Everyday life costs more. In other words, you receive the money last, but you pay the higher prices first. That is inflation as a hidden wealth transfer. And since 1971, after the final break from the gold standard, the constraints on money creation changed fundamentally. The money supply began expanding more aggressively, slowly at first, then faster, then at extraordinary speed during the crises of the modern era. The result is a long-term erosion of purchasing power. What used to buy $10 worth of goods decades ago now buys only a fraction of that. That is not a rounding error. That is the systematic destruction of the value of savings, wages, and future purchasing power. Every dollar held in cash or sitting idle in a bank account loses value over time, not because someone steals it in plain sight, but because the monetary system quietly dilutes it. And according to this view, 1971 was the turning point. That was the year the rules changed. That was the year money became unanchored. And that was the moment the modern economy began separating asset owners from wage earners in a way that still shapes daily life today. Here is where the generational divide becomes impossible to ignore. If the dollar were always going to lose value, then the rational response would be simple. Stop holding dollars and start holding assets. Things with real scarcity. Things the government could not simply create more of. Real estate, stocks, commodities, art. And that is where the split begins. The people who already owned assets in the early 1970s, mostly older Americans who had already bought homes and started building investment portfolios, benefited from one of the greatest wealth expansions in modern history. Not necessarily because they worked harder, not necessarily because they were smarter, but because they were already positioned on the right side of a system that was about to reward asset ownership far more than wage income. A house bought for $20,000 decades ago might now be worth hundreds of thousands. A stock portfolio did not just rise with economic growth. It rose because decades of newly created money had to flow somewhere, and much of it flowed directly into asset markets. That is the core of the divide. If you owned assets, the system lifted you. If you depended on wages, the system slowly squeezed you. And the numbers reflect that reality. Older generations accumulated wealth in a period when assets were still affordable relative to income. Younger generations entered adulthood after prices had already been pushed far beyond what wages could support. So the gap we see today is not simply a difference in discipline, character, or work ethic. It is the compounded result of those who already owned appreciating assets when the rules of the monetary system changed. That is why the housing gap feels so brutal. For older generations, buying a home was difficult, but still realistically tied to income. For younger generations, the price of housing has drifted so far away from earnings that ownership now feels less like a milestone and more like a moving target. And every year, that target moves farther away. Add to that student debt. Add wage stagnation. Add the rising cost of living. And what you get is not just a temporary hardship, but a full-scale affordability crisis, one that threatens long-term mobility for an entire generation. What makes it psychologically devastating is that the system still presents itself as a meritocracy. From the outside, it says, work hard, save money, and make responsible choices, and you will succeed. But when the structure of the game is already tilted toward asset owners and away from wage earners, effort alone is no longer enough. Working harder inside that kind of system can feel like running faster on a treadmill that keeps accelerating. That is why so many young adults cannot save for a down payment. Not because they are lazy, not because they are reckless, but because wages have not kept pace with the price of the thing they are trying to buy. And while they save, housing prices continue to rise. So the goal does not get closer, it moves farther away. That is what makes the trap so demoralizing, and the consequences go far beyond money. When independence becomes mathematically unaffordable, behavior changes. More young adults stay with their parents longer, not by preference, but by necessity. Not because ambition disappeared, because the economics of independence broke down. Once home ownership starts to feel impossible, people adapt psychologically. They stop believing that traditional saving will get them where they need to go. They begin looking elsewhere. Riskier investments, speculative platforms, crypto. Not always out of greed, but often out of desperation, because conventional paths to stability no longer seem realistic. And then there is something even darker. When the future feels unreachable, consumption in the present starts to make more sense. This is where doom spending comes in. Young people are spending heavily on experiences, status items, or short-term pleasures, not necessarily because they are irresponsible, but because they no longer believe that sacrifice today will meaningfully improve tomorrow. If a house feels permanently out of reach, then saving for one can start to feel pointless. And if saving feels pointless, immediate joy becomes easier to justify. That is not irrational. That is what hopelessness looks like when it gets translated into economic behavior. And that may be the cruelest part of the 1971 trap. It does not just reduce purchasing power. It does not just widen the wealth gap. It changes the way people think. It changes the way they plan. It changes the way they live. It teaches one generation that patience and ownership lead to wealth, while teaching another that no matter how disciplined they are, the finish line keeps moving. That is not just an economic problem. That is a civilizational one. So what do you do with all of this information? The first and most important insight is this: cash is not really savings anymore. In the world before 1971, keeping money in a bank account was considered responsible. Your dollars generally hold their value. Patience was rewarded. Saving made sense because the currency itself was still a relatively stable store of value. But in the world after 1971, cash sitting in a savings account is not truly safe. It is a slowly depreciating asset. The interest your bank pays is usually lower than the real rate at which your purchasing power is being eroded. So even when the number in your account goes up, what that money can actually buy often goes down. Year after year, you may feel like you are saving money, but in real terms, you are slowly falling behind. And that is not an accident. That is how the system is built. That is why interest in so-called hard assets has exploded. Hard assets are things with limited supply, things that cannot simply be printed into existence. Real estate has long been the classic example, although for many young people, it has now become almost unreachable. Gold has historically played that role as well. It is often called hard money for a reason. And then there is Bitcoin. Love it or hate it, Bitcoin makes far more sense once you understand what happened on August 15th, 1971. Its entire design is a reaction to the loss of monetary discipline. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. No central bank can create more of it. No government can approve a new supply. By design, it is digital scarcity. In that sense, it functions like gold, except its scarcity is enforced by mathematics rather than geology. You do not have to believe in Bitcoin as an investment to understand why it resonates so deeply, especially with younger generations. Its appeal is not just financial, it is philosophical. It reflects a profound distrust in fiat money, central banking, and political promises. An entire generation has become so skeptical of the modern monetary system that many would rather trust code and math than governments and central banks. And that tells you everything about how deep the 1971 trap really goes. Here is the hardest part to accept. This system is not likely to fix itself through normal politics, because too many powerful institutions benefit from the way it works now. Governments benefit from being able to finance enormous spending through debt and monetary expansion. Central banks benefit because the modern financial system has become dependent on constant intervention and liquidity. Large corporations benefit because they have privileged access to cheap capital. And major asset holders benefit because newly created money tends to reach financial markets before it reaches ordinary wages. This is not simply a Republican problem. It is not simply a democratic problem. It is a structural problem built into the monetary foundation of the modern economy. And that is why waiting for a political solution may be the most dangerous form of denial. For individuals, the only real option is to understand the rules of the game as it actually exists, not the version of the game people were told existed. Because the rules changed in 1971. And much of the financial advice passed down from parents and grandparents was designed for a different world. Save your cash. Work hard, and you will get ahead. A dollar saved is a dollar earned. That advice was not necessarily wrong when they learned it. It was calibrated for a system that no longer exists. Today, working alone is often not enough. Promotion alone is often not enough. even job hopping is often not enough, because the deeper problem is structural. And now there is a new layer of pressure emerging on top of all of this: automation and artificial intelligence. As more early career white-collar roles become vulnerable, even the labor market itself is offering less security than it once did, which means the treadmill is not slowing down. It is speeding up. And the people who do not understand the system are the ones most likely to be crushed by it. Conclusion: the map was wrong. The American dream is not dead. But the map people were given to reach it is decades out of date. You are not struggling because you are lazy. You are not falling behind because you lack discipline. And you are not failing because you are bad with money. You are struggling because you are playing a game whose rules were quietly rewritten long ago, while most people were not paying attention, by institutions and decision-makers who had every reason to keep those new rules invisible. And the first move, maybe the most powerful move available to you, is simply to see that clearly. To understand that the dollar in your pocket is not the same kind of dollar your grandparents held. To understand that saving cash in the modern economy does not mean what saving meant in the world your parents were taught to navigate. To understand that the widening gap between your productivity and your paycheck is not some random accident. It is part of the design. And once you see the 1971 trap, your choices begin to look different. You start thinking less about preserving cash and more about preserving purchasing power. You start valuing ownership over perpetual dependency. You start recognizing why scarce assets matter, why hard assets matter, why fixed supply stores of value matter, why relying on a single paycheck in an unstable labor market may no longer be enough. None of this is easy, and none of it is as simple as the old map promised. But at least it is honest. At least it reflects the terrain as it actually exists. Because the real question is not whether you are working hard enough. The real question is whether you are working from the right map. So ask yourself this: are you still betting on the dollar? Or are you already looking for a way out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this changed the way you see the economy, the housing market, your savings, crypto, or any of it, subscribe. Because this is not the end of the conversation. It is the beginning of the conversation we should have been having for the last 50 years.